I beat Raft without swimming, and here's how. Hi friends, and welcome back to Raft. In case it wasn't incredibly obvious by the vast amounts of water around me, a decent amount of Raft takes place in the water. In a normal playthrough, you're supposed to dive around islands to gather resources, then bring those resources back to your raft to continue your journey. But what if you weren't allowed to go swimming in the first place? Well, that's what I set out to do in my most recent challenge run. So let's load up a brand new world and get started. As we load in, we spawn on the typical 4 squares that make up the center of my raft world, and from here we can start gathering the flotsam around us just like we would normally. Now if you're trying to speedrun the game, I would typically jump into the water here and grab resources by hand because it's faster and easier, but I won't be doing that during this run for obvious reasons. That means I need to spend a few minutes gathering resources until I can craft my building hammer and a few other resources that we'll need to make this challenge possible. Now, I'm willing to bet that the majority of you watching this video have at least some familiarity with the detail plank glitch popularized by Let's Game It Out, and that lets you breathe underwater when you stand on a plank. And while that is a fantastic glitch that would be very useful here, it doesn't really help me in the early stages of the game. As a quick refresher for those who maybe haven't thought about Raft's progression system in a little while, in order to have access to the detail plank recipe, I would need to unlock Tier 3 trades at the trading posts that are found on large islands. The trading posts themselves only accept 2 kinds of currency: trade coins, which you get by spelling specialty fish at the trading posts themselves, and trash cubes, which I would need to have in order to buy the bait that I need to catch those fish in the first place. So I need trash cubes to get trade coins, and I need both to buy the blueprint for detail planks, which is the item that unlocks the recipe for me to use in the rest of the playthrough. This is a hard-locked progression system, and there's no way to bypass it. So this is our only pathway to unlocking detail planks, and that would mean that I would need a way to get trash cubes. The only problem with that is that the only way to get trash cubes is via inserting raw materials into a recycler. And the problem with that is that the only way to unlock the recycler is by grabbing a blueprint off of the whiteboard in the first story location. So to summarize everything I've said up to this point, I would need to complete at least the first story location before detail planks are even an option. And that means that I need another method for grabbing those handy underwater resources that doesn't involve our friendly plank glitch. Enter our dear friend, the Scarecrow, and the item that makes all of this possible, the shelf. Building in Raft is a simple endeavor with only a few options available to you in the building hammer menu, but limits create ingenuity, and ingenuity can sometimes lead to genius discoveries. In this case, it means that placing a shelf on a wall allows you to rotate that shelf to any angle that you want, and any items that you place on top of that shelf will be similarly rotated away from their original position. I've used this in actual building applications like the bowsprit on my galleon raft, and it can be used to make some really cool designs. But here, it's going to let me use the Scarecrow as an underwater platform. You see those tiny little arms sticking out of my Scarecrow's sides? That's what we're going to be standing on. So after a couple of careful placements and tests to make sure that this would even work, I had my Scarecrow platform ready to collect our first bits of sand, clay, and copper. And here's where we encounter the second problem of this run. Most of those precious underwater resources are a lot deeper in the water than I can reach on my little platform. And before I get my hands on a detail plank, I don't have a way to go further down without triggering the swimming animation and therefore ruining this challenge. But there is some good news. On this particular small island variant that I've lovingly nicknamed Split, there are 2 copper ores within reach of my Scarecrow platform. The bad news is that these are the only 2 copper ores within reach of my tiny Scarecrow platform on any of the 10 small islands that Raft can generate. And the other bad news is that I would still need the sand and clay to get myself a smelter to use that copper ore. And the only sand and clay that I can find within easy reach are on this island that I call Twins. So this involved a decent amount of sailing around an otherwise empty world to try and find those 2 islands so I could make the smelter and get the copper ore ready to start Raft's story. I only really need 2 of each, both sand and clay, to get myself started, and only 1 copper bar and 1 metal ingot for all of this to take off. That's because I decided to use a recently discovered glitch from the speedrunning community that lets you craft discovered recipes for free by doing a save loading technique while pressing a couple of buttons to open a menu before the game can even realize that that menu is open. And that then in turn lets you craft anything that you want without having to have the necessary materials. Now, don't get me wrong, I could have gathered all 26 pieces of sand and clay, 22 copper ore, and 11 metal ingots by trying to repeatedly find those same 2 types of small islands over and over again over the course of many real-life days. But I found that using this glitch was significantly faster, easier, and less painful for my mental health to prevent me from going insane. So by using this glitch, I'm not necessarily changing the success of beating the game without swimming, just cutting down the real-life time necessary to do so. I don't want to hear anyone griping about that's not what the game intended, because the game intended you to go swimming, so we're not doing anything as the game intended in this run. So after researching my dry bricks and all of the other stuff to unlock the smelter, I got my hands on my first copper ingot and researching that unlocked the rest of the recipes that I would need for now. Jeremiah continued to be an annoying presence, lurking around me and munching off bits of my precious platform, but fortunately, this may be the one playthrough where he didn't even get a taste of my toes. And that's saying something, considering I've died over 3,500 times in this ocean floating simulator. But after successfully crafting the necessary story components using that free crafting glitch, I placed them down on my raft and we were finally off to the first story island, the radio tower. The radio tower itself is a pretty simple story location, and it eases you into the way that Raft's story is told, which is primarily through a few notes and a little parkour. There is an underwater area to the radio tower, but it's not at all necessary for the story to progress, and it just houses a couple of loot crates and a few extra resources, but nothing that I needed. In fact, the only things that I needed from this location were at the very top of the tower on the whiteboard, and that's mostly the code to the next story island, though I did grab the recycler blueprint just in case I wanted to use detail planks down the line. The thing about using detail planks for the rest of this run is that there are easier and less time-consuming ways to do everything that a detail plank would do, aside from the underwater breathing. And because I don't have a need to go underwater to gather resources anymore, I don't need to spend all of my time going back and forth between trading posts to level up my trading capacity to get the detail planks, and I can just go straight towards the second story island, the Vasagotten. Water and swimming really isn't an issue on this location, aside from getting onto the boat in the first place, and that's done easily enough with a little ramp and a jump. But once you're on the boat, there's no need to leave it to enter the water. Heck, even the swimming pool is empty, so there's no need for swimming on this island at all. The only threat to my well-being in this challenge and this entire area is these darn little lurkers, which are honestly more annoying than they are a true threat. And I could be a typical raft player and spend my evening running up and down through the layers of this yacht to grab all of the parts for the bomb to unlock the top deck, which is an easy route if you've memorized it, and I have. Or I could be the cheeky speedrunner that I am, and simply third-person clip my way up from level to level to beat this ship in just about 40 seconds, which ironically isn't even close to my personal best for beating this location. For more of an in-depth explanation of what the third-person clip is, I've explained it in plenty of my other videos, and it's a normal feature of Raft used in an unconventional way. Once inside that final area, I picked up the blueprints for the steering wheel and the engine, as well as the code for the third story island, Balboa. Between story islands, there really isn't too much to do other than hook up the debris floating past me and occasionally fish for some food. But other than that, I was just sailing. Balboa specifically always spawns against the direction of the wind, so I did have to place down an engine for this one, but that really doesn't take up too much time or energy, especially with that free crafting glitch. Balboa Island is canonically Balboa Mountain, but with the drastic sea level rise that caused the raft world to be what it is, it's now a very tall island, but also still a mountaintop. And mountaintops can have some beautiful lakes, but I don't particularly fancy swimming through this radioactive sludge to begin with, and that is the closest thing to a water hazard that we will find on this whole area. Throughout all of Balboa, I just took my normal island route of making it onto some scrap of land with my handy ramp after getting myself nice and close to the island. Then I just stood still for a while until the unstuck button appeared in my pause menu, which teleported me to Balboa's South Beach, which is a great starting point to beat the island from, and it doesn't require any swimming whatsoever. Once on the South Beach, it was just a matter of running up the left side of the mountain until you find this little dirt patch below a tree. If you jump off that patch and run into the wall, you'll drop directly into Mama Bear's cave without her aggroing on you. And that way I could pick up the blueprint and the loot box from the shetty without even having to gather berries. Plus, if you are fast enough, you can make it out of the cave just as easily by running in a straight line. Mama Bear actually has a pretty small aggro radius compared to everything else in the game, which honestly, thank goodness for that. She has ended plenty of my speedruns by whacking me with those big ol' paws enough times. But anyways, from here, we just continue through the island past Bobby's incredibly complicated maze, up to the first relay tower. This tower requires you to lower the drawbridge to get across, and you can do that with any of the rocks that are strewn about the ground here, or you can use literally any other projectile in the game, including your trusty hook. So with a good yeet and a big crash, all I had to do was climb the steps to the first tower to turn on the first relay station, and start making my way to the second relay tower. The pathway here is nice and simple, and this cave right here is exactly why I bothered to stop and grab the machete in the first place, because this is the one tower you can't really get to with just parkour. But those vines are the only obstacle in our path to finishing the rest of this tower. We can climb the stairs, say hi to Johnny for good luck, and pull the lever to activate this tower so I could move on to the third and final tower. As for getting down from this tower, this is where it's fun to realize that Raft only deals 50 fall damage at a time. So it doesn't matter that I can reach terminal velocity by falling off of this big cliff, because it won't take more than half of my health, and that's still plenty for me to move forward with. The third tower is where you will find that poison lake, and as I mentioned, that is the only real swimming hazard for me here. But not even really, because it's far too shallow to go swimming in. I'll take that as a win, but if I really wanted to avoid the danger altogether, I could have just Skyrim horsed my way around the left side of the fence and been totally fine either way. But this tower works just the same as the other two. Climb the stairs, flip the lever, and just like that, we have the code to our next story island. Ironically, the hardest part of completing Balboa Without Swimming was getting back to my raft. Normally, I just jump in the water and wait for the unstuck button to teleport me there, but obviously that wasn't an option for this run. So I got in a little extra parkour practice by jumping around the outside of the island until I saw my little scrap of home. And once I was safely there, we moved on to the fourth story island, Caravan Town. Caravan Town is one of the 3 story islands that have swimming areas that are necessary to beat the location as the game intended. For this island specifically, you're supposed to dive down along this side of the island while following the tubes that have bubbles coming out of them. There are convenient stopping points with breathable air pockets for you to replenish your oxygen before continuing down, which culminates in the shipping container where you unlock the metal detector and a zipline part. There are 3 zipline parts necessary to unlock the zipline tool recipe. The first of the other 2 is easy enough with that water puzzle where you fill up a well to make the tool rise to the top. The final part, however, requires explosive powder to launch Detto's rocket, which in turn releases one of these zipline parts. However, to get explosive powder, I would need to dry out the explosive goo left behind by poison puffers, aka Wrath's version of creepers that are slightly more annoying. The only problem with that is that poison puffers will not aggro on you unless you are in the water, and I wouldn't be able to retrieve their remains without entering the water either. But launching that rocket is the only way to get the third zipline part. Those zipline parts are necessary to craft your first zipline tool, which is what you are supposed to use to navigate around all of these separate sub-islands from the central tower. With all of these complicating factors in mind, how could I possibly beat Caravan Town without swimming? I've got one word for you: ramp. See, Caravan Town has the advantage of being a completely outdoors location without any substantial landmass or other barrier preventing me from just taking my raft to wherever it wants to go. And on this island, there are only 2 places I really need to go. Those being the infirmary, where I can easily jump up around the hogs to make my way over to the top caravan, where I don't even need the key to unlock the door because I can just grab the mayor's key through the window. And then I can go directly over to the mayor's tent. The ramp only needs to be about 25 tiles tall to make this entire location nearly pointless, as well as completely mitigating the need for the zipline tool, which in turn allows me to skip anything that would require swimming. Again, you could do the underwater part to get the zipline tool with the detail planks, but why bother going through all of that effort and those resources when a ramp works just as well? After making my way up through the ramp and into the mayor's office, I picked up the very important mayor's hat and unlocked the box to go grab the code for the next story island, Tangaroa. Tangaroa, or the golf ball as I like to call it, is a floating city encased by a large glass dome, which is the other barriers I was referring to with the ramp working perfectly for Caravan Town. Sadly, the ramp alone isn't enough to get us through this entire location. If I were playing the game normally, I would enter through this small port on the left, go pick up a series of generator parts to solve a puzzle, and try and access the city through a tube, which would then malfunction and inevitably flood the whole bottom of the city, and that would force me to swim through the puzzles. Obviously, that route is a no-go if we're trying to avoid swimming, so I'm going to need a different solution to avoid the city basement entirely. And that solution comes in the form of yet another ramp, but this time with a platform and a chair on the end. As I have said before and will say again, physics isn't real and can't hurt you. And in this case, physics not being real means that we can just ignore that big glass ball and float right on through it to be in the main part of the city. If I were truly just speedrunning here, I would simply walk up to the main tower, go over to one edge, and third-person clip my way in through the door to access the elevator right away. But I can already sense that some people in the comments are mad that I've skipped most of the story island so far, so just this once, I'll finish Tangaroa as intended, albeit minus the ziplining part because we didn't pick up the ziplines in Caravan Town. So I did spend a little time running around taking out butler bots for their access cards and invading people's apartments for duct tape, repairing the flooded plantation even though we didn't flood it, and unlocking the elevator quote-unquote the right way, just for you. If it were up to me, I would have just done the elevator skip, and here we are. I entered the launch code into the keypad and sent the bridge flying, and that just meant that I had to open one of those side gates next to where I had carefully left my raft, sail around to the bridge, and use my lovely little ramp to get inside the bridge without any swimming at all. And inside the bridge and next to the ladder, I found the key to the 6th-story island, Veruna Point. Again, I'm mostly skipping over the parts in between story islands because it really isn't all that interesting to talk about waiting for your raft to travel 1,500 meters repeatedly. It's not like anything exciting was happening aside from Jeremiah's occasional intrusions. But with Veruna Point in front of me, we're back in business for the swimless run of Raft. Veruna Point is where most players would lose this challenge, considering that the entire basis for this island is a series of underwater rooms that you're meant to swim through to gather things, and that whole big boss fight is an entirely underwater bullfight with an overgrown rhino shark. Heck, even the speedrun strats for this island typically involve swimming down to the double doors and going around them to grab the Temperance code, but obviously that isn't an option for me. Fortunately, there's nothing our handy ignorance of physics can't fix. Veruna Point has a reputation for being one of the easiest locations to speedrun for the simple reason that all you need to do to beat it is grab the code from inside this room. And that means the only challenge is getting into this room, and we can safely ignore the rest of the island to beat the game. If you're playing normally, you would need to beat the Rhino Shark to gain access to this room with the crane key, and then you can use that to drop a big pile of rocks onto the short building and open it up from the top. But again, we're not beating the Rhino Shark here. Remember how we floated through the glass dome at Tangaroa mere minutes ago with no repercussions? The same rules apply here, and a chair placed on top of a pillar at the right height simply allows me to fly through the wall and end up in the final room without ever having to touch the taller tower, let alone go swimming through any of the rooms below it. So it's as easy as walking up to the table, grabbing the code, and getting back to the raft to move on to the next location, Temperance. Temperance is a bit weird as a location, not only because it is by far the largest story island, but also because it is the final story location where swimming is supposedly a forced activity. The first challenge is getting onto the main landmass because I can't swim across any of these smaller gaps in between icebergs, so I needed to get right up next to the big island, which fortunately was decently simple with my small raft footprint and the long ramp that allowed me to cover a wide distance. Once on the island, nothing was stopping me from navigating the town normally, as all I had to do was gather enough wire from the receiver towers and link everything up until the big dome opened, and then I could grab the blowtorch off of the table inside. The observatory is a different story, because if I were to fall into this large sinkhole that appears in front of the observatory entrance, the only way out is to swim through this tunnel until you reach a ladder that leads up to the observatory interior. Fortunately, I obviously know that that sinkhole is there, and it's pretty easy to avoid. Unfortunately, that door is locked from the inside, but I'm not giving up that easily. With a little third-person clipping and a little more game knowledge, you can easily open this door from the outside and get inside the observatory without entering the sinkhole, and therefore without needing to swim at all. Then I can just punch in the code to the stellar locker, and we're off to the reactor. Because I picked up both the blowtorch and the reactor key, I just need to open the big reactor door and proceed through the rest of the reactor as you would in a normal playthrough, because there's no water or other swimmable liquids inside. However, I can never pass up a good opportunity to show off Temperance clip when one arrives, so here's my absolute favorite speedrun trick we use to play Raft fast. Once the reactor door is open, run onto the doorframe and sprint into the wall. As you are running, quickly press escape, then exit to the main menu, making sure to save your world. Then reload the save, holding sprint in a straight line into the wall. When the world loads, you will be inside the door, and if you did it correctly, right as the top of the door starts to touch your head, the collision will shove you through the floor and into the cryo chambers below, effectively skipping the rest of the reactor sequence. So from here, we can quickly say hi to Shogo and grab the final story code off of the laptop. We don't even need to manually make our way back to the raft, because Temperance is the one location where the unstuck button will always take you back to your raft rather than to a set location on the island, which is mighty convenient in this situation. And from here, we are headed to the final story location, Utopia. Now, like many of the story islands before it, none of Utopia requires swimming to complete in the first place, but I was feeling particularly lazy and didn't want to deal with that horrible spinning parkour area, so I went for the much easier route of building a big ramp, plonking a bathtub at the end of it, and simply ignoring the laws of physics to get myself into Olaf's tower. Olaf is rightfully amazed by my mythical presence and magical bathtub suddenly floating through a wall 200 feet above sea level, and backs himself out of a window, which reveals the key we need to end the game. So then we grab the key off of Olaf, pick up a few vending tokens for fun and profit, and then send ourselves careening off of the side of the skyscraper to make our way down to the final door. After carefully landing on the walkway and not in the water below, I can open the lock, keeping the Utopian citizens inside, and officially end my raft challenge run with the final cutscene. After that finishes, the game kindly places us in the plaza, where an alternate version of Olaf is still here chucking bombs at people because we skipped this area, and although I may be on fire, no part of me has done any swimming in the entirety of this playthrough, which means that I have successfully beaten Raft Without Swimming. So check that off the challenge run's bucket list. Anyways, I think that's everything for me for now. I hope you enjoyed. Please consider leaving a like if you did, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. It would be much appreciated. I hope to see you all again soon, but until then, have a great day.